I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of splicing techniques that you'll be using in the Tempestry project. The first is how to weave a tail in when you're starting a new bundle of yarn. The second will be the day separator, the very thin yarn, this dark green stuff that can go between days if you want to use that to delineate days. And then the third is a splice between 2 different colors. So the first thing, I've got the close-up of the loom here that I wanted to show you is this is what it looks like when you've finished weaving in a tail end. And if I lift these up a little bit, you can see that what is happening here is the 4-ply yarn supply has been unplied and divided up into 2 and 2 individual plies. And one of those smaller tails is going through each shed so that you can see each warp thread has 1 thread over it and 1 thread under it. And that just locks them in so that they don't go anywhere. So we'll zoom back out here, get on the full loom, and I'll show you how this works. The first thing that I like to do when I'm going to do this is go ahead and unply before you start trying to get your hands in the loom. So to do that, you just twist the yarn opposite the direction it's twisted together, get your fingernail in there, and separate. And you can see this is a 4-ply yarn with 2 and 2. So next I'm going to go ahead, figure out which shed I'm in. I need to be in the other shed. I'm going to take my yarn through, leaving that split tail on, in this case, the left-hand selvage or left-hand edge. Go ahead and beat it in. I change sheds before I beat, so the next thing I do is take one end through this shed, change sheds again, and one end through the other shed. And take it between 2 and 3 warp threads over. You'll notice when you do this at the left-hand edge, you see how that selvage is a tiny, tiny bit lower. If you just leave it alone, it will take care of itself on the next couple of passes, so you don't need to worry about it. If you do decide that you want to build it back up and not have that slightly low point, all you do is go ahead and weave your next pick. And then before you go through again, we're going to wrap around that once, an extra wrap around before going through. And that just builds up that edge a little bit so that you don't have a blank spot. If you didn't know that I had done that, if you hadn't watched me do it, and we'll close up on that edge, it really doesn't show that you've done that at all. It just gives you a little bit of extra structure right around that spot. So that is how to weave in a tail end. The next thing we're going to do is look at how you would go about putting a day separator, that thin line, in when you're going to not change your color of yarn. So I've got 2 days in a row that are the same kind of light green color. This is this is actually like a 32 degree day I'm weaving. So what I'm going to do is I figured out how many passes across I can go with 1 yard of yarn, which is 1 day. And I figured that out by taking just one of my 1 yard lengths and weaving it across as a sample and seeing how many times it took me across. Once you've got that across, I'm just going to leave this tail over here, and I am taking my very thin, dark green, almost black yarn through for my day separator, and I'm going to go ahead and weave that in. Now, what will happen if you notice when I've got 1 pass in, I've got basically a dotted green line because you can only see it where it's going in front of warp threads, not where it's going behind. So to get a solid line, you always have to do 2 sequences. So we're going to go across once, and I'm going to go into the middle. This is meet and separate. I'm going to meet them in the middle. You can see this spot where they're meeting. And then I'm going to go 2 or 3 more and overlap them. And with this yarn, it is so thin that overlap is never going to show. And overlapping them puts them right up against each other where they can get a little bit of friction against one another and it prevents them from slipping out. So you definitely want to overlap them by a couple when you do this. Now, I just continue with this light green yarn I was using for that 30 to 35 degree range, I think is what I'm working in. And I keep weaving. And that darker yarn is so thin that you never see where I left the lighter yarn hanging to get around it. So that's how you get the degree separator in, or the day separator, in without breaking your yarn and doing unnecessary splices. You'll have a lot of days where you've got the same color yarn several days in a row, and that's how you do it. And again, I just left that. I left the thicker yarn hanging at the selvage while I wove the next day in. Okay, so next we are going to do the, whoops, sorry for that clatter. We're going to do how you would manage a change of color from one day to the next. So I'm weaving in this green yarn, this light green yarn, until I run out. If you run out on the very edge like this, you kind of have to judge whether you've got enough to come back in and splice safely, or whether you need to back it up a little bit, and you'll start to figure out what that means. So I'm going to take this in as far as I can. I want to use as much yarn as I can. I took it in 5 raised warp threads, and I've got my little split tail there. And just like I did with weaving in the ends, I'm going to take half of that piece of yarn and put it under the next 2 warp threads. So you can see I've got half of it under the next 2 raised warp threads. Now I'm going to take my day separator yarn and I put it in, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm taking all of it because it's thin back to overlap. Now here's the only tricky part about getting that degree separation in while you're in motion or changing colors, is that you have to do 2 full passes, if you remember, to get that to where it shows, but you're starting not at the side. So there's a partial pass. Here is a full pass. And now I have to go another partial pass to get to where that one was. I'm going to snip this off my bobbin. Now we're also going to splice, so I don't have to just meet this one. I bring it over 2 more, and I grab my next color of yarn. I don't beat in until after I get both yarns in. It helps me not get confused. So I'm opening up this one, unplying it. I'm going to take this one and go, there we go. Okay, now let me just show you. This is where I'm bringing it just to meet right now. So I've got these 2 ends, the dark thin end and the darker green thicker yarn right here. And then I'm going to take just that half and move it back. So I've got my single ply thin dark green yarn coming to there, and my darker green double ply or 4 ply yarn coming to there, splitting, and 2 of them going to there. So my ends of the wool yarn are right here, 2 raised warp threads apart from each other. There's nothing magic about 2 raised warp threads. That to me is just the amount that is required to make it work without being so much that it shows. So I recommend at least 2 warp threads. You can do 3 if that makes you more comfortable. It will tend to show just a tiny bit more, but 2 is going to be sufficient to lock it in. And so I weave the rest of this day. So this is what I was talking about earlier, exactly 1 yard of this particular yarn. So this is a good place to count my sequences. So I've got, keeping in mind I have a half sequence. There is the 3rd full, or I shouldn't be saying sequence. The sequence is a pair. My 3rd full pick or pass, and there's the 4th. there's the 5th. Here's the 6th. There is the 7th. And here is the 8th. So I know it takes about 8 trips across, or picks is what they're called in weaving, to get 1 yard of yarn in there. And that'll be helpful as I make my design. So the last thing I'm going to do before closing this video is snip these little ends off. You can't snip them off until you've got a little weaving above them, so always weave a couple, 3, maybe 4 picks before you snip them off. And to snip, I'm pulling up pretty firmly, putting the sharp point of my scissors right next to the surface of the cloth. I'm doing it flat so that I don't inadvertently poke in and cut a warp. And there you go. And you can see that that is a very smooth, soft finish where I snip those ends off. And that's splicing.